So I begin with acknowledging, I'm not sure how comfortable he is about being called an elder, but Professor Babahamore. Because in many ways, he exemplifies a lot of what we're talking about today. In fact, the topic I'm talking about today is connected to Babahamore through Frantz Fanon and all of you in very special ways. You see, the title of my talk is Fanon, the Teacher. And let's face it, a lot of times when you all go to hear about Fanon, there are all of these obsessive debates about who reads Fanon exactly the right way, who has the right, all of this stuff. And in the midst of it, and many of you are familiar with these debates, and you already know that I know a thing or two about Fanon. And you also know that with Nigel Gibson here, okay, with Babahamore here, you have people who have written quite a bit on Fanon. But what struck me is very few people have devoted time to Fanon, the teacher. In fact, some of the early courses I've taught around Fanon was actually connected to the question of teaching and pedagogy. And for those of you who get interested in the subject, there's a wonderful book by a scholar in Manchester, England, Erica Berman, where she looks at Fanon and education. But you notice I didn't say Fanon and education, I said Fanon the teacher. So I'm going to talk a little bit about teacher, okay? But I'm going to start by just a basic fact, okay? The basic fact is, as many of you know, anytime you're talking about anybody like Fanon, first of all, if you're going to talk about revolutionary, there are people who are going to get a little nervous. And then, if you put the word revolutionary and the word black together, oh man, they get downright diuretic. So, I'm going to start with an allegory, a colonial allegory. It might be familiar to some of you. I wrote about it in one of my books. In fact, the book, Her Majesty of the Children, I have the story in there. During the period in the Caribbean, where there were the colonies of England, there were Anglican schools. The British had Anglican schools. And a minister was sent to go and evaluate one of the Anglican schools. You got it? And so the minister goes there, and as it so happens, on that day, there was a boy who was late for school. So he's running to get to school. And as he reaches the gate, the Anglican minister reached the gate, and he stopped the little boy, and he thought he wants to check the benefits of a good colonial education. He turned to the little boy and he said, "Young man," and the little boy looked at him. He said, "Could you tell me who knocked down the wall of Jericho?" And the young man knew exactly what to say. He said, "Not me." Now at that moment, the minister was outraged. So he took the little boy and he said, "Who's your teacher?" Let's just say, "Mr. Smith." He goes to Mr. Smith and he says, "Are you Mr. Smith?" And you can imagine poor Mr. Smith, right? Mr. Smith, you know how hard it is for there to be a black teacher in a colonial school. You imagine the humiliations, the suffering, the time all Mr. Smith went through so he could be in that classroom. And this minister is there with this little boy, and he looks at him and he says, "Are you Mr. Smith?" He looks at him and he says, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, I just asked this young man who knocked down the wall of Jericho, and you know what he said? He told me?" I said, "What did he tell you, sir?" He said he didn't do it. And Mr. Smith looks at the boy, looks at the minister, and Mr. Smith takes off his glasses. He says, "Well, sir, I've known this boy a long time. If he said he didn't do it, he didn't do it." I think you summarize the discursive problem of colonialism and coloniality in that allegory. Don't you get a sense that when you're talking about these issues, you're mostly talking with people talking past each other, or people come already made up their mind what they want to say, so they only are not speaking just enough time to just tell you what they want to say, and they're not listening. Okay? And this is one of the tragedies. There are many tragedies of colonialism. But one of the great assaults of colonialism is the assault on our ability to listen. Okay? And not only that, you'll see the power mechanisms in this. Because of course, you wonder what was the meaning of that question in a context when there's this overarching power and representative of the colonial state towards this child and this teacher. Now, I bring this up mainly because in contexts like this very institution, the new frame, what Tricontinental is about, there are many things that these organizations are about. But why are there meetings where we gather together like this? Why are there dossiers? Why are so many things put together? What are they for in terms of the praxis of intellectuals? And that is ultimately, and this is something many intellectuals forget, is because ultimately, if you are an intellectual worth your salt, you're a teacher. Now, of course, it's very complicated what's a teacher, especially when teachers have grandiose titles like professors. Okay? Not all teachers are professors, but and whenever I teach, I usually start my courses with a conversation, what's a professor? And it's very funny when you have that conversation with students. Because students, I ask them what's a professor, and what's a student, and it's very interesting. Most students, when they answer what a professor is, their answer comes down to a professor being like Moses coming down with the tablets. Could you imagine trying to argue with Moses? Hey, Moses, I don't agree. Moses goes, I got the tablets. You see, the problem with that model of the professor or the teacher is that the professor or the teacher becomes akin to the voice of God. And I usually have a conversation afterwards where I say, well, let me tell you what I consider a professor to be. A professor, at least the way I see myself as a professor, and not just as a professor, I would argue all intellectuals, all teachers see themselves this way. They're people who fell in love with learning. In other words, they fell in love and continued to learn. And in fact, if you continue to learn, you are a lifelong student. So the difference between the student and the teacher is simply the teacher is an advanced student. That's really what it is. In fact, what I do every day is I try to go to bed asking myself, did I learn something today? And I ask myself, what was it? And you'll find all people, all particularly revolutionary teachers, are that way. El-Malik Shabazz, known to you as Malcolm X, made sure that every night he went to bed asking himself, what did he learn that day? He made a point to read a book, go to a museum, have a conversation. One of the reasons he could communicate the way he could was because he wasn't talking at people, he was listening while talking and interacting, and he wanted to learn from them. Because if you think about it, what students are people who, although they're beginning to learn a subject, they come to it with unique experiences. And those experiences create a new relationship to the subject, which reveals what every committed teacher knows, which is although we offer the best we can to our students, we're always learning from our students. Okay? And so, the importance of this understanding then is that organizations like this one, meetings like this one, are not simply about what you can learn from me, or from Michael Neocosmos, or from Nigel Gibson. I do hope while you were circulating, eating, afterwards, you're talking with each other, because it's also what we can learn as a community. If you can understand that you're in a world of learning, that is the spark of the beginning of a radical democratic consciousness. Because you see, if you don't think there's something you can learn from your fellow human being, then your attitude to political life is to treat your fellow human being more as a tool or an instrument for your desires, your wants, or even your needs. But if you understand the idea that we're in a co-living project of freedom, then you could understand that there's no closed model of democracy. There's no closed model of what it is to think in a revolutionary way. It's open. And that was Fanon's thought. There are many ways people talk about Fanon, but they forget that crucial element. And so I begin with first, well, I already began. So I'm going to add now, first, there are certain cliches about the way we think. One of the techniques of colonial mentalities is to have you trapped in cliches. Because you see, cliches encourage laziness of thought. You don't have to think it, because simply you repeat the cliche. But if you question, if you become radically questioning, for instance, to have a conversation on what a teacher is and what a student is, makes a student begin to say, wait a minute, I shouldn't be a vessel that receives knowledge. I should be an agent of knowledge. I should be actively involved. And anybody who's a teacher should be sufficiently secure to be able to be in that active relationship. You see? But there are other ways we think passively, we don't even realize it. For instance, we have political cliches. You know what's one political cliche that dominates a lot of thinking? And Fanon was very critical of this, is the view that somewhere out there in the world, there's a group of people, by virtue of their identities, that got it, whatever it is, right. Now think about that. If there's some people who just got everything right, whatever that everything is, it means all you gotta do is find those people and imitate them. It means you have no responsibility for your knowledge, for your actions. You just imitate them. But what Fanon, Cabral, in fact, all Biko had this view too, and there are many others, all the way through to antiquity. What they understood was that the problem with that view of looking at the world is that it erases the humanity of people. Okay? And the reason it's an erasure of the humanity of people is because there's only one kind of being or beings that could have everything right. And you know what that being or beings are. You all know the answer. God. I don't know, are there any gods in this room? If there are, then I'll drop my mic. Got to defer to God, you know what I mean? But you see the point. In a way, we don't realize it, but when we set up certain group of people to be intrinsically the sources of having things right, we turn them into gods. In fact, that's one of the other tragedies of colonialism, it makes people think in a way that treats colonizers as gods. And we don't even realize how that sneaks into, even when we think we're using revolutionary critique, we're often reinforcing the status of colonizers as gods. Earlier, for instance, there was a reference to this example of there's this fetishizing today of black people as a kind of nether point outside of the framework of humanity, in which simply what whites or whatever category of colonization you want to have do acts upon black people. The problem with that is, one, it's an absolute ignoring of history. This room exists because a bunch of people of all racial backgrounds, but definitely people who were black, got off our asses and fought. We're not passive recipients of history. Second, when we were even talking about these recognition discussions, the reason examples like those about a slaughterhouse and a cow make no sense, they sound really good, but they make absolutely no sense, is because a human being is not a cow. At the end of the day, the example sneaks in the idea that you can only be if you are recognized as those who dominate you as being. But if you really believe that, then you would have a world like this. There are a lot of people in the room, you're of different backgrounds, but if we use the racialized background, how many of you people in the room who are designated black, when you got up this morning to brush your teeth, you looked in the mirror and you said, oh damn, I'm still black. Did any of you? You know, there's this weird academic theorizing that treat black people as if we get up every day hating ourselves. As if we lack the capacity not only for love, but to be loved. Now, if you're a black person who cannot embrace the love from a fellow black person, I think you need a therapist. I think you need to deal with certain other issues. But beyond that, if you're a person who is so scarred by the notion of a lack of love that you cannot love others, because you see, you have to understand, if you're fighting to transform the world, and this is something Fanon wrote in Pour Noir Mas Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask, it's easy, in fact, it's easy to have narcissistic love. Narcissistic love is when someone walks up and says, I love you. And you say, why? And the narcissist says, because you're like me. Now there's a problem with that. Because you know what happens? It means you disappear. We human beings have the capacity for non-narcissistic love. You could say, I love you. The person says, why? Because the freedom you embody as you is something that's precious. And you don't have to be like me. If you think about when we fight as revolutionaries, and this is something, again, Fanon argued, it means you fight for a room that could be like this. Because remember, you're living in a country where a room like this was illegal. This room exists because some of you, for instance, a teacher in this room, Maboko More, the reason I was acknowledging him is not only because he's an elder, but he faced a complicated choice. When he went to the United States to get his master's, he could have stayed, but his commitment to the struggle meant he had to come back here, and he taught here because he saw teaching that love, that radical love for people who may not necessarily return the love. The future depended on the radicality of that love. I don't think when he came back, when he was teaching what across the country today, for instance, there's Limpopo, he did not even imagine that this room in this moment would exist this way with him sitting in it. And this tells you something, because the future is never made visible to you. It's always opaque. And you know that radical love, where a person isn't your mirror? That radical love is opaque. And this is one of the reasons why teaching and love are linked. Because when you are in the process of your learning with others, what may come from that learning, you cannot predict. Which means every act of learning requires risk and courage. The next political myth that you have to address is this naive view that you can achieve anything if you have a big enough crowd. Because what it does is collapse people into a formless mass. The kind of differentiation for that radical love means you simultaneously can deal with the general and the specific at the same, redundant, same time. Okay? Now you may ask, how is that possible? And this requires, again, being relieved from what I call lazy thinking. For instance, I remember when I was a student, I don't often talk about the political work I do, and there's a reason for that, which is that I'm very critical of what I call the commodification of politics. I don't think people who are committed to political work do it to sell their resume, all right? You'll be surprised the people whom I know, that a lot of people don't know, are actively doing important revolutionary work and are not ever recognized or acknowledged, and they don't care. Why? Because they act from radical love. The struggle for them is more important than their individual recognition. Okay? But I remembered when I was doing some work, I was with when I was a student, a graduate student, because I'm still a student, I'm just an older student now. And I remember we were talking, and she said, "Oh, what are you studying?" And I'm saying, "I'm studying philosophy." She said, "Oh, philosophy." I said, "Well, what's wrong with that?" She said, "Oh, it's so abstract. I do the concrete," she said. And I said, "You know, the concrete is an abstraction." We're good friends to this day, by the way, so that didn't end the friendship. Similarly, when you're really thinking, real thinking always requires generalizations. Why? Because when you speak, if it stops simply at the moment you have spoken, it would be incommunicable. The mistake is not generalizing, the mistake is overgeneralizing. Is to move from some to all. Is the failure to understand the complexity of the interrelationships. Or to put it in a different language, is the failure to think dialectically. Now, a lot of people love to say the word dialectics, but they don't understand it because they work with cliches. For instance, a cliche is the old Hegelian, the way people read Hegel, which is totally wrong, which is you have a thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis. But that's complete nonsense. What dialectical thinking is you start with something you presume is universal, and then you discover it is not. That discovering that it's not means there is something beyond it. And so now that contradiction makes you reach out. But here's the thing, where you move is not predetermined. It's not linear. If you thought the world was this room, if someone opened the door and said, "What are you all doing in here?" you wouldn't know if you step outside which direction in which to walk. You will only realize that here was a false inside. You got it? And that means dialectics is always about the creativity of how to deal courageously with the uncertain. It's about freedom. And this is something Fanon in Le Damné de la Terre. I prefer to translate the damned of the earth, but you know it is the wretched of the earth. That's the heart of what he was arguing. Because apartheid, for instance, tells you there are two universals. A lot of people miss this point. The universal positive was to be white. But that meant not being white was treated as a universal negative. And that's what collapses into this silly ontological discourse of ontological blackness. Because it treats blackness as an absolute negation. However, a human world is a world of communication and interaction. That's why apartheid South Africa and all colonialisms don't want interaction. Because you know what happens if you interact? You find out the colonizer is not a god. And those who are supposed to be in the colonizer's world finds out the colonized is not a demon. We keep looking for gods and we try to run from demons, but we keep bumping into human beings. But here's the crucial thing about human beings. Human beings are not a perfection. What human beings are fundamentally is a possibility, which means, and this may be hard for you to grasp right now, human beings are not ontological. And that's a technical term, but to put it simply, we're not fixed beings the way gods are. I'm going to talk about, first, a misconception about how Fanon understands the self and the other. And then I'm going to talk about Fanon's understanding of therapy. Okay? Because there's a lot about Fanon. Some people look in a very condescending way about Fanon's work in psychiatry and psychoanalysis and those other areas of thought. And one of my colleagues in this room, Nigel Gibson, has done excellent work on the political and humanistic significance of his psychiatric work. But the reason I'm going to start with one other example is because in the context of this country and all across the globe, this problem dominates the way people deal with race issues. And I think I just had to put it on the table. It's basically this. Most people think of racism as a problem of being the other. But that's a big mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is because, you see, what racism actually does, what colonialism actually does, is to create a world of people who are selves and others, because this is an incoherent sentence, this is a problematic sentence. Here I am, and here is another bottle. It makes no sense, because I am not a bottle. You see what I'm getting at? It makes sense to say, here I am, and here's another human being, here's another human being, here's another human being, and so on. You see what I'm getting at? So the other is a necessary condition of ethical relations. The reason there's nothing wrong with being an other is because you cannot have ethical life without others. You know that narcissistic love I told you about? That is when it's the self and only the self that matters. Here I am, and here's another me, which is not a real other. You see? Real others are free. Real others, I have responsibility in relation to them. What racism does is to say, here I am, here are my others, and then there are those who are not others and not selves. So if you fight against racism, it's not about being against being the other. It's actually a fight against a world that tries to push people outside of ethical relations. But here's the thing. You don't want to make the people who push you outside become the standard. because you would affirm their presumed right to dehumanize and to degrade you. So it means you must take responsibility for building alternatives. That's the argument. Now the second one connects to something important for you all to know. There are a lot of people who write about Fanon and psychoanalysis, for instance. And it's really, really silly. Even some people who are friends of his would say, oh, it's ridiculous to talk about Fanon and psychoanalysis because Fanon was never psychoanalyzed. And when I hear that, I usually say to them, and who psychoanalyzed Sigmund Freud? In fact, it's based on a naive view of psychoanalysis. Freud psychoanalyzed Sigmund Freud. Fanon psychoanalyzed Fanon. And this is important for you to think about. What people are really doing, why they're so adamant against Fanon and certain intellectual and medical practices, is because of a lack of ability to understand a black thinker as an originator of thought. Think about it. When many white thinkers use ideas from other white thinkers, say Hegel using Kant's ideas, Marx using Hegel's ideas, Freud using Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's ideas, and we could go down the list. Foucault using Kant's ideas and Nietzsche, etc. You know what their use is called? Influence. Now this is very interesting. When a black thinker is in fact influenced by the ideas of a white thinker, too many people don't analyze the influence. That influence can still lead to originality. They simply look at the black thinker as an application of the white thinker. You see? To put it simply, right? Black, basically today's fashion, like black body in white thought. Okay? But that's really problematic because a lot of people it never occurred to a lot of them that many of those white thinkers were influenced by black thinkers. Because it's just not even in their imagination there. But they don't realize this. Jean-Paul Sartre, when he wrote it's really the right translation is Reflections on the Jewish Question, but it's known in English as Anti-Semite and Jew. The person who influenced him to write that was Richard Wright. Okay? Yeah, Richard Wright. What had happened was Richard Wright and Jean-Paul Sartre were hanging out in Harlem, and Sartre said to Richard, tell me about the black problem. And Richard Wright said, black problem? There's no black problem, there's a white problem. And at that point Sartre thought, oh, there's not a Jewish problem, it's the people who hate Jews. Simone de Beauvoir, it was Richard Wright who said to Simone de Beauvoir, you know, you really should write a philosophical study on the very question of the meaning of woman. And that led to the second sex. Now, it doesn't mean that Beauvoir's thought wasn't original or Sartre wasn't original, but it's inconceivable to many people that black thinkers have affected white thinkers. And in fact, if you know actual intellectual history, I could go through a whole lecture on black thinkers who have affected white thinkers. Fanon influenced Sartre in a very interesting way, because when he wrote Point Noir Mas Blanc, you know what I just said about dialectics? That was his actual critique of L'Orphée Noir, Black Orpheus. The critique was that Sartre was imposing a closure on dialectical movements. And as a consequence, that's why he failed to understand the revolutionary possibilities of negritude. What Sartre realized was that proper dialectical thinking, when he saw that critique, and I know he read it because it was published, right, by a protege, right, Francis Janson of Jean-Paul Sartre. There's no way he's going to publish it and say, hey, check this out, it's had a critique of you. And Sartre realized that he had to rethink dialectics, and it became the critique of dialectical reason. If you look at most Sartre studies, the claim was disenchantment with communism, and then he's moved by the Polish struggle, because they got to find a white source instead of looking at the historical fact of a black source. And there are many other examples. There's a lot about the origin of a lot of concepts that we work with, if you know the actual intellectual history that comes from those other kinds of thought. Now, the thing about Fanon as a psychiatrist is that Fanon did something rather interesting, but you have to read it in the French to see the subtlety. Fanon made a distinction between people who came to him as a client versus people who came to him who became a patient. And this is crucial. It's crucial because when somebody comes to him, Fanon does not presuppose that person is sick. You see what I'm getting at? He has to interview the client to determine if the client is sick. And what he observed early in his career, and he hints it in Point Noir Blanc, but it's there in his essays and psychiatric writings as well. Really think about this. Imagine you are a therapist in South Africa, okay? If a black person comes to you and says, I'm feeling miserable, and you ask why, and the person says, I'm humiliated all the time. There's a presumption at my job that I'm incompetent. I'm stopped by the police, and the list goes on and on. If a black woman comes in and says, I'm really dealing with problems from a long range of issues, from sexual violence to the diminution of my intellect. And by the way, the sexual violence issue is not exclusively female. It's a very complicated thing. Many people don't realize how much part of colonialism is the use of sexual violence as a technology of subjugation. It really is. It's true. It's its core. All you gotta do is travel. You could always know you're in a colonial country because you feel the sexual intensity. It's literally in the air. You could touch it. You could almost smell it. And that's because any society that tells you that people should not be together, they should not have agency, you might as well find a child and say, you can eat whatever you want in this kitchen except those cookies in the jar. Those become the most desirable cookies ever, okay? But now, you can go on. If you're a trans woman or a trans man, and you come in and you are really going through anger, etc., you know what Fanon's response to that is? You are suffering because you're normal. Think about it. Isn't there something perverse to say, I'm so happy I'm discriminated against. I'm so happy about racism. I love the fact that I'm trans and people hate trans people. It's so good. In other words, what colonialism tries to achieve is an abomination called the happy slave. The person who's happy with her or his or their degradation. And Fanon said, that is what's unhealthy. You see what I'm getting at? If a patient showed up and said, I'm so happy, a client, Fanon would say, we need to talk a little longer. And so we get this crucial difference. And Fanon's response to that individual is you're suffering because you're experiencing a lack of agency. The solution there, in a nutshell, is not to sit on a couch, is not to get pills for that problem versus an actual person with illness. Fanon made a distinction between neurological illness and mental illness. The actual solution for this problem, the clients, is to become politically active. That's the solution he argued. Okay? And so once that solution is there, we come now to something different. Because what Fanon argued is the fundamental source of much mental illness, not all, but most mental illness, it turns out to be narcissism. Because think about it. The people who respond to colonialism by organizing, by going out, by building institutions, by teaching, by doing work, they come home with a sense of self-esteem, dignity, pride, because they know every day they stand up for themselves. However, the person who says, I don't care about other people, I care about me, the narcissist, then that person says, I don't mind that other black people are treated like shit, as long as I don't. You see what I'm getting at? I don't mind if a lot of other women are degraded, as long as I'm not degraded. That's the narcissist. And that means at the very moment, at any moment, the narcissist is attacked. The narcissist isn't attacking the injustice of the system. The narcissist is dealing with the personal notion of saying, I should be an exception to the system. And that is narcissism. And Fanon sees that as the mental illness. You see? And so now we come to why I say Fanon the teacher. Because a lot of you don't know this, but Fanon taught for most of his life. We know him as the revolutionary. I mean, Fanon is a really great superhero. You could do a great comic book, you know, of a person who died by the age of 36, you know, graphic novel, you know, Fanon. You could. He was really that badass. He was really that great. But from his childhood, Fanon was always the individual who functioned as a leader in his communities, and using the plural, not out of being the toughest, the meanest, but because of his capacity to love. He had authority because of his intelligence and his actual concern for human dignity. And his friends learned from him, because remember, he wasn't the eldest of his siblings. And in a lot of the communities, even when he was in war, when he was in World War II, he wasn't in any big official role. And later on, when he was working in the hospitals, throughout, what many of you may not know, he had students. And his attitude was exactly like the one I just outlined about the student with the fellow students. In fact, he was so committed to it that even with the now patients, the actual patients, he took it that it wasn't simply upon him as the therapist to cultivate their mental health. The patients needed to work with each other in community to cultivate their mental health. You see what I'm getting at? So he was a teacher by way of example. And there were also courses he taught. And if any of you are interested in looking, you can easily find some of his lectures, mainly because the students took such good notes. And they were so good that you could hear his voice in the notes. He taught a course on sociology and psychopathology for the École okay, in Tunisia. And in that context, he talked about a lot of the themes I'm talking about here. But what's fascinating, if you go and read those lectures, and you go and listen to what the students and reports of the interactions, a lot of the ideas he articulated are ideas which today a lot of people attribute to people such as Michel Foucault. But he was before Michel Foucault. For instance, Fanon talked about how transformed technologies produced certain kinds of subjectivities. And I'm going to finish in a minute. Okay? He talked about, do you know there was a time when people worked without a clock? And he showed the kind of mental illnesses brought on workers with a clock. Because there's this constant question, if you're not to the clock, that you've done something wrong. So the clock began to function as a kind of surveillance on your consciousness. He gives this great example. You all may not realize this, but most automobile accidents happen from people on their way to work. You figure if they've had breakfast, they're alert, they should have fewer accidents. At the end of the day, when they're tired and coming home, they should have more accidents. It's the opposite. Because in their subconscious, there's anxiety about going to work under the clock. The clock functions like a slave driver, a foreman. So the thing about teaching then is that what all his patients said and his students said is that although he was charismatic, although he had all this, and by the way, he published quite a bit, an extraordinary amount of literature in a short life, they were amazed by how fully attentive he was with every one of them. In other words, he understood that the art of teaching is also the art of learning. And if you think of revolutionary praxis in that way, you begin to understand what it is to work together to build new concepts, as Fanon put it, and set afoot a new humanity. Thank you.
We're going to take the usual. Can we have someone who has not asked a question?
Could we also, some of you may have seen this, I have what's a very extraordinary memory. So everybody who has a question, please ask. Even if we run out of time where I can't answer all of them, pay attention to what each person asks, because there's a lot of learning in the questions they pose, okay? So anybody who has a question, just move the mic around.